Well, hello, everybody, and thank you so much for coming to our first workshop in this series that we're calling Critical Conversations in Catholic Education. And in this series, we're taking a look at climate change and eco-social resilience. This series, which is a series of 3 events, was funded by a generous grant from the Association of Theological Schools, which is the accrediting agency for the Faculty of Theology at the University of St. Michael's College. And we hope that this series of 2 workshops and 1 conference will provide an opportunity for teachers and theologians to think together Sorry, just working my PowerPoint. So that it'll provide an opportunity for teachers and theologians to think together about supporting young people in this time of climate crisis. We know that schools, both at the local level and at the board levels, already do a lot to incorporate learning about the climate crisis into their curricula, which certainly addresses the knowledge part of the equation. What we want to think about today is the heart part of the question. How do we help students navigate the anxiety that is a natural response to wildfires, warming oceans, storms and droughts, and all that stuff? That is our focus for today's workshop and in our follow-up events, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And before we get started, Marianne in the back there is going to take a couple of photos during the event. And if there's anybody who doesn't want their face in the photo, if you wouldn't mind like kind of waving at Marianne at some point. Thank you. So it is our hope that this workshop and our related events will lay the groundwork for a long-term collaboration between Catholic school boards and the Regis St. Michael's Faculty of Theology to talk about all kinds of challenges that are facing young people in the 21st century. This question of eco-anxiety and eco-resilience is merely our first conversation like this. So we are kind of inventing this as we go along, so I'm hoping that you will have patience with us as we go. So let me introduce our team today. My name is Cindy Cameron, and I am one of the co-directors of this project. I am the Patrick and Barbara Chair of Religious Education and Assistant Professor of Religious Education at the Regis St. Michael's Faculty of Theology at the University of St. Michael's College. I teach in the area of religious education, particularly Catholic education. My research tends to focus on adolescence, Catholic schooling, and Catholic theology. Before coming to Toronto, I was for 20 years a Catholic high school administrator and religion teacher in the United States. Our second team member who's here today is Rosemary Boissonneau. Give everybody a wave, Rosemary. Rosemary is a PhD candidate at Regis St. Mike's, where she studies both eco-theology and the Bible. Her dissertation explores how the Hebrew Bible portrays fertile land as a maternal co-creator with God and as a medium for God's blessings. Prior to her doctoral studies, she was a teacher with the York Catholic District School Board for about 30 years. Gabrielle Chan, give everybody a wave. Gabrielle Chan is a graduate of our Master's in Theological Studies program at the University of St. Michael's College, where she completed a master's thesis on youth climate anxiety under the direction of Hilda Koster. She is a teacher with the Toronto District Catholic School Board, teaching Canadian and World Studies at St. Patrick High School. And she's going to say more about herself when in just a little bit. Hilla, I'm going to mispronounce your name, Lautinen? All right, Hilla Lautinen is a PhD student at Emmanuel College at Victoria University at the University of Toronto. Her research examines the theological construction of human agency within the context of the climate crisis. She works as a research assistant for the Elliott Allen Institute for Theology and Ecology at Regis St. Mike's and is a coordinator for the Trauma-Informed Pedagogy program at Emmanuel College. Today, she is managing our online attendees and will be the liaison between them and all of us who are in person. And finally, Hilda Koster, who is the co-director with me of this project, unfortunately is unable to be here this afternoon. Her mother died last week, and she had to travel to the Netherlands for the funeral and to be with her family. But Hilda is the Sisters of St. Joseph of Toronto Associate Professor of Ecological Theology and the Director of the Elliott Allen Institute for Theology and Ecology at RSM. Her research focuses on the intersection of ecological theology and environmental ethics. Also with us are Erica and Emil, who are over there in the corner, who are here to talk to anyone who might be interested in thinking even more about how Catholic theology can inform teaching, administration, and ministry at Catholic schools or in any other setting. They can tell you all about the exciting degree and certificate programs that we have at RSM, as well as about funding opportunities for enrolled students. So enough of the housekeeping details. Let me say a few words about the agenda for today, and then we will jump in. So first, Rosemary and I are going to provide a brief introduction to some terms. And in this, we're going to be using Britt Ray's really helpful book, Generation Dread. Then Gabrielle is going to introduce us to the results of her research on eco-anxiety among her students. After this, we will invite you to join in the conversation about the presence of eco-anxiety among your students. In part 2, we will look at Catholic resources for thinking about eco-anxiety. I will kick us off with some theological language and some religious education perspectives that can help us think about our young people and climate anxiety. Then Rosemary is going to talk a little bit more specifically about Catholic social teaching and Pope Francis's Laudato Si, to highlight some of the ways that schools can help young people towards eco-resilience. After that, you'll be invited to join in the conversation again. And we'll also have some time for questions or ideas that come up. We will end with some invitations to our next events and some more social time, hopefully. Okay, some terms around our topic. Eco-anxiety is the chronic fear of environmental doom. This is how the American Psychological Association defines this, but it is not a diagnostic category. In other words, it is not a maladaptation. It is not pathological. Rather, it is a description of an appropriate response to our contemporary experience. This notion of eco-anxiety points to our sense that something is not right with our common home. We also use the terms eco-distress and climate anxiety as synonyms for eco-anxiety. Another helpful term in this is global dread. Global dread is the anticipation of an apocalyptic future state of the world that produces a mixture of terror and sadness in the sufferer for those who will exist in such a state, both themselves and future generations. It is a feeling of dread, knowing that things will be worse for the generations that follow us. Climate anxiety occurs across generational, racial, and class markers. It affects young people in some pretty profound ways. A BBC survey found that most kids worry about the climate crisis. 20% of surveyed kids report having nightmares about the climate crisis. 40% do not trust adults to manage the crisis. And 40% of them feel that their voices are being ignored in all of this. In a survey conducted by Britt Ray for her book, 45% of kids felt that eco-anxiety negatively impacted their day-to-day life, and over half said that humanity is doomed. And nearly 40% said that they are hesitant to have children. Many older people are distressed by the rapidity of change and a profound sense of grief for their grandchildren, for the extinctions that they are witnessing, and for the state of the environment that they are leaving to future generations. While global anxiety is a new term in the global north, it is a feeling that is shared across geographical locations. Indeed, the global south has been living in this state of heightened most intensely, whereas middle class and upper class white populations tend to be more able to insulate themselves from the effects of climate change. Settler colonialism led to the decimation of indigenous populations, the extermination of animals, and the disruptions of ecologies. For many marginalized populations, eco-anxiety is merely one existential threat among others that they experience. Eco-anxiety is, in a lot of ways, a sign of our collective trauma. But it is also a sign of hope. Feeling maladjusted or eco-anxious is the right response to a traumatic experience. In other words, feeling anxious is a sign that we're paying attention to what is deeply wrong in the world. Our emotional response to the climate crisis is what's going to get us to act for justice and change. And at this point, I'm going to turn things over to Rosemary to talk a little bit more.
Good afternoon. So I'm going to be speaking about climate denial, which is still something that very much exists. And I'm getting a lot of the information also from Britt Ray's excellent book. So humans have evolved to overvalue immediate concrete threats while ignoring ones that are perceived as far off and abstract. Climate change still seems abstract and distant to us because it is what we would call a hyper-object. A hyper-object is distributed across space and time to such an extent that our minds cannot fully comprehend it or think about it as a contained phenomenon. Because of climate change's enormity as a hyper-object, we cannot perceive how or where to intervene to cause meaningful change. When confronted by inescapable and overwhelming threats, humans often experience psychic numbing. As more people experience the dangers of climate change, psychic numbing towards the climate crisis becomes more widespread because we don't know how to intervene to reduce the threat of such a hyperobject. Many of us don't engage in the reality of climate change because it elicits painful feelings, and we lack safe spaces to express and explore them. Moreover, fully acknowledging the reality of climate change means recognizing that we are complicit in systems that force us to behave in ways that contribute to the crisis. Instead of dealing with these psychological and emotional discomforts, we detach from the reality and enter into denial of some form. So Britt Ray speaks of three types of climate denial. First of all, the outright climate denial is often ideological and vested in corporate, political, and other interests. It can exist on both levels of individuals and institutions. For example, since the early 1980s, fossil fuel companies like Exxon have known the negative climate impacts caused by burning their products, and they chose to protect their profits and hide the truth from the public by funding climate denial and disinformation campaigns. On the individual level, denial manifests in personal attacks on climate scientists and activists, especially women and racialized people, in the form of ridicule and cyberbullying that is often misogynistic or racist. The next form of climate denial is negation. And this is the psychological defense by which one pushes away realities that are too difficult to cope with. Negation occurs when people deny the truth of climate change's dangerous consequences. So for example, an example of climate negation is developers who continue to build and rebuild in flood risk zones like on the Florida coast or in High River, Alberta, even when homes have been destroyed in these areas due to climate-induced disasters in the recent past. The final and most prevalent form of denial is disavowal, and it's a psychological defense against the climate crisis. It sort of amounts to a type of soft denial, whereby we believe the climate science, we understand the risks and are concerned about system collapse, but we play down the threats so that we can continue to live our lives, I'm assuming it says lives, our lives according to our desires. We're of two minds and loyal to two contradicting sets of values and aspirations. This is what psychologists call a perverse state of mind. You need the next slide. Sorry. And it involves different parts of the self forming lying relationships with each other to protect the self from pain and anxiety. Such perverse states of mind actively work against our ability to mitigate and adapt to the crisis. Examples of disavowal and perverse states of mind are everywhere. For example, the popularity of trucks and SUVs, the provincial government insisting on, and I know this is a topic for this region in particular, the government insisting on building highways through sensitive ecological lands and fertile farmlands, or its refusal to phase out gas heating in new home construction. So this widespread disavowal creates a culture of uncare. Again, a term that Britt Ray uses. And a culture of uncare maintains and promotes the social acceptance of selfish impulses and short-sightedness. Another offshoot of disavowal is a prohibition against talking about the climate crisis in emotional terms. Climate scientists who express alarm or sadness about their findings are dismissed as lacking scientific impartiality. This can also be true of teachers who don't just stick to the data to make room for their students' emotion when they teach about climate change. Oh, glad I'm finished that page. Even when emotions are included in the conversation, there's this urge, and this is even among people who call themselves climate communicators, there's an urge to focus exclusively on hope and the positive messaging while ignoring climate anxiety, fear, and grief. So it's okay to talk about emotions in some situations, but only if they're positive ones. Nonetheless, if it is not denied, ignored, or dismissed, eco-anxiety can become adaptive when we are in touch with our capacity to care. And this is where teaching in a Catholic school can really help in this. It can serve as an antidote to the culture of uncare when we bring our thinking and feeling together. When it functions in these adaptive and positive ways, eco-anxiety emerges as eco-compassion or eco-empathy. Thanks. And we're going to hear from Gabby now. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, I'm just gonna.
Sorry, I don't mean to create a wall. I'm just not as balanced as they are. I need a table. All right. Here we go. Good evening. It's my pleasure to be speaking here tonight. I'd just like to start by sharing a bit about me just to provide context as to what I'll be talking about. So under the mentorship of Dr. Coster, and what an amazing experience that has been, I completed my final paper on Laudato Si and how it can be a source of hope for our youth. One of the reasons why this was my focus of research is because I'm a teacher myself. I teach in the Canadian World Studies and as well as the Social Sciences and Humanities Department. And the subject of climate change and its impact are a constant theme. In geography class, for example, we discuss the effects of deforestation, environmental degradation, and the impact we have on our ecosystems. We see the impacts of climate change on the Earth and human populations as people escape disasters and become climate refugees. In our history class, we see the timeline of events, discoveries, and inventions that have slowly progressed into the decline of the landscapes of our environment today. In our nutrition class, we connect climate change with food scarcity and the rising costs of food. I teach amidst the hustle and bustle of Toronto. I teach high school students. The reason I mention this is because it's so easy to assume that our youth are so consumed with their personal dramas, Instagram feeds, or TikTok reels, that it is easy for society to dismiss them. But anyone who works with our youth will realize that climate change and the impacts of it touch them deeply. It just might not be as obvious until we really sit down and ask them. This is what I did for my research. I have a beautifully diverse population at my high school. Many of my students have roots from abroad and are first and second generation immigrants with strong ties to family from their countries of origin, many of which are countries from the global south, where economies are still developing and where the effects of climate change are more pronounced. This can be seen in deadlier tsunamis, more extreme weather events, heat waves, floods, and longer-lasting droughts. My students come from countries including the Philippines, Ethiopia, Trinidad, Cuba, Rwanda, and Syria. I point out my students' countries of origin and ties to provide context to their understanding of climate change's impact on the Earth, society, those to whom they are connected, and themselves. For many who have ties to the global South, climate change impacts them and their families deeply. Though the state of the Earth has been a concern for scientists, civic organizations, and theologians for decades, the problem has not been brought to the forefront of mainstream societal concerns until recently. As a result, it has finally been placed on center stage in school curriculum. There is now a general increase in awareness. It is on the radar of society's youth. This has led to youth taking ownership and rising up in protest. However, other issues have arisen with this realization. Climate anxiety, a sense of impending doom, the negative impacts on mental health. Today's youth have become the unfortunate victims, the inheritors of the transgressions of generations past. And so the million-dollar question then becomes, how can our youth even begin to respond to an issue that's so immense and seemingly insurmountable? Today's youth have much to bear. Not only have they had to experience the emergence of a worldwide pandemic, when they look to the future, they often see the doom and gloom that is often connected with climate change's current trajectory. Where then can they find hope, and how can they build a spiritual resilience in response to our climate crisis? Perhaps the answers can be drawn from works with religious and spiritual foundations. More specifically, Pope Francis's Laudato Si on care for our common home. The focus of my research was on the application of Laudato Si to my work with youth and how Pope Francis's encyclical can meet today's youth in responding to contemporary issues and developing spiritual foundations as a means of remaining grounded and hopeful. I began my research by finding out where my students stood. Without mentioning Laudato Si, I provided some statements from the encyclical to see what my students agreed with. A few of the statements they strongly agreed with included the following, and I'll just read a few of them. When the Earth suffers, humanity suffers. Science has a role to play in the conversation about the world, about the future of the world, but so does our Christian faith or spirituality. And our faith or beliefs calls us to be the kind of people who will not let the earth be despoiled and people forgotten. As educators, we often do not realize the impact that we have, or if what we teach truly reaches our students. Sometimes it's about planting the seeds and hoping a sense of civic responsibility and general care for others and our environment will sprout sooner rather than later. Often what we see and observe in our student interactions, what they share, and what their lives seem to revolve around only scratches the surface when it comes to the depth of feeling and care they have for what is going on around them. On the surface, students seem to care more about social media, messaging friends, and sleeping in than about global pressing issues. However, when truly pressed on issues, our youth are more aware than we may give them credit for, and the feelings of hopelessness, hurt, fear, and even anger prevail when discussing their futures and the future of the planet. It's no wonder they don't talk about it. As a result of my students being from or having connections to the global south, they are deeply aware of the challenges that climate change brings. When asked about the impact of climate change, some experiences they share include, and I'll just read a few of them, more violent hurricanes for the people in Cuba. My cousins in Trinidad tell me about the floods they get, and some days they have to skip school because of them. Many floods have occurred in the Philippines. This has caused many homes to be destroyed. It's been in the news, and it's terrifying to think that everything you've worked for can be wiped out in a flood. Climate change is also having a disproportionate impact on low-income communities, indigenous peoples, and other marginalized groups that are less able to adapt to these changes. And so in all these statements, what hit me most was what my students thought about the state of the environment and how they felt about the state of the world as a result. We know that climate anxiety exists. We know it deeply impacts young people. What my students expressed was deeply saddening. In response to being asked what they thought and how they felt about the state of the environment in the world, some of what they shared included the following, and I'll just read a few. The current state of the environment is bad and needs to be helped, but I feel powerless knowing that there's more evil than good. I feel ashamed when I think of the state of the environment because we are human beings and we're meant to protect the earth, but we are the ones destroying it. I feel angry that so many government systems and businesses don't care at all. I feel as if my kids won't have a safe place to grow up, and that scares me. Words that are repeated include powerless, helpless, sad, hopeless, worried, disappointed, angry, depressed, terrified, mournful. These comments and feelings coincide with one of the largest surveys done on attitudes towards climate change. Climate change and climate anxiety is taking a toll on our youth's mental health, causing negative feelings, which can lead to psychological distress. Research has found that religion and spirituality can aid the mental health of our youth, including those that suffer from ecological devastation and eco-anxiety. Having spiritual and religious beliefs, identities, practices, and communities are all correlated with better mental wellness among youth. Many of our youth feel connected to nature, and those who do not revel in the opportunity to do so. There is a subtle but ever-present yearning for connection, including connection to the earth and connection with others. Many may not connect this draw to their faith or spirituality, but this desire to reconnect with something greater is very much a spiritual longing. Laudato Si provides practical suggestions, including approaching nature with awe and wonder, connecting with others and with nature physically, not just digitally, civic and political love. Psychological research has discovered that isolation is on the rise in youth, as are unprecedented levels of sadness, hopelessness, loneliness, and self-preoccupation, including focus on the self, individualism, narcissism. Pope Francis states, when people become self-centered and self-enclosed, their greed increases. One way to counteract this, studies have shown, is to elicit awe in our youth. This can include connecting our youth to experiences that are artistic or exposing them to big buildings like cathedrals and beautiful places in our natural world. To be witnesses of and to sit in awe of creation makes it that much harder to watch as it crumbles before our very eyes. The study of climate change and caring for a home should not be limited to geography class or religion class. Care for a common home should be integrated in all classes, just as Catholic social teachings and Catholic graduate expectations should be integrated into all subject areas in the Catholic school system. An interdisciplinary approach to climate change that invites spiritual development is vital to exploring the issues, problems, and solutions, and approaches that will hopefully lead to hope instead of despair and action instead of anxiety. At the end of the day, this is what our students need: hope for a better future, inspiration that will empower them to be better, expect better, and be a part of something better. Thank you.
So I want to turn to some theological resources that can help us in talking about climate anxiety, particularly with young people. And to do this, I want to draw on the work of a Catholic practical theologian, Elizabeth Gandolfo, a Dominican theologian from the Netherlands, Edward Skillebeeks, and a Catholic religious educator, Teresa O'Keeffe. And here I'm focusing kind of on the anthropological question. In other words, the question of what the climate crisis and eco-anxiety have to tell us about how we understand ourselves as human beings in relationship with God, one another, and the entirety of creation. So first is Elizabeth Gandolfo. And she gives us this notion of vulnerability as a theological construct, as something that defines humanity. We all are vulnerable. We all feel vulnerable. For Gandolfo, vulnerability is the sense of human finitude that makes us vulnerable to harm and hurt. At the same time, it is our very vulnerability that enables us to be open to love and relationship and care for others. So for example, having a body makes us vulnerable to disease and injury, but it also opens us up to pleasure and joy and creativity. Similarly, love binds us together in pairs, in families, in social groups, and so on. But love also makes us vulnerable to hurt and harm. No one can hurt us like those we love, right? Edward Skillebeeks, with his long and hard to spell Dutch last name, describes for us what he calls negative contrast experiences. Negative contrast experiences are those experiences that show us that something is just not right with the world. It is the feeling deep in our hearts that the way things are is not the way things should be. Or to put it in theological language, the way things are is not the way God intends them to be. These negative contrast experiences are therefore a goad to our work for care and justice. To make the world a better place, to make the world into the better place that God wants, to act morally in the world, to look out for our neighbors, and to confront evil when we see it. For me, these two ideas, vulnerability and the negative contrast experience, come together in the climate crisis. Humanity, in all of its vulnerability, has tried to exploit the earth and its resources to make ourselves feel less vulnerable. And in doing so, we've caused harm to the planet, putting ourselves at greater risk for harm. So in our attempts to manage our vulnerability, we have made ourselves more vulnerable. Thus, anxiety in the face of the climate crisis is an appropriate response. It is our recognition that the way the world is now is not how God intends it to be. Eco-anxiety is our negative contrast experience, calling us to make changes. However, while adults might be able to manage their eco-anxiety in productive ways, adolescents certainly need more support from caring adults, both to name what is going on and to be resilient in the face of a sense of global doom. To talk about how adults can do this, I turn to religious educator Teresa O'Keeffe. In her book, Navigating Towards Adulthood, Teresa O'Keeffe suggests that what adolescents need from adults is a different way of thinking about the relationships between adults and adolescents. She suggests that most contemporary teenagers, especially in our Euro-North American culture, spend the bulk of their time in the company of other teenagers or alone in their room. Many teens spend as little as 45 minutes a week in conversation with a caring adult who is completely focused on them. She suggests that teens experience a sense of isolation from the adults in their lives to whom they could turn for help and support. In place of this, O'Keeffe invites adults who work with and are related to teenagers to cultivate what she calls robust relationships with them. These are the kinds of relationships where kids feel heard and feel known in deep and profound ways. Certainly parents can and should have these kinds of relationships with their kids, but adolescents also need to have relational support from non-parent adults. So aunties, friends of the family, youth ministers, chaplains, teachers, coaches, folks like that. And it is in the context of these robust relationships that kids can talk about their anxieties, their sense of vulnerability, their sense that there's something wrong with the world. Without these kinds of relationships, teens can often feel like they have to go it alone and figure it out for themselves. And to be clear, I am not suggesting that every teacher needs to be cultivating these kinds of robust relationships with each and every child that they teach during the day. That would be both unwieldy and unrealistic. Rather, I take O'Keeffe as saying that as a school community, and especially as a faith-based school community, each student ought to be seen and heard and valued by someone. That the school can cultivate the kinds of communities where each student can find an adult or two who will know them deeply and be able to listen to them as they figure out how to be an adult in this confusing world. In this case, an adult who will say to them that they are anxious, an adult who will themselves say that they are anxious about the state of the climate, that they will share their own sense of eco-anxiety, who will describe the ways that they are managing their eco-anxiety and what they are doing. So at this point, I'm going to turn things back over to Rosemary, who's going to talk with us a little bit about Laudato Si and how we are called to create these kinds of communities.
So just to start, though, I want to just go back a little bit. Gabby's research shows that climate anxiety is felt by young people regardless of their class, race, economic status, or place of origin. However, climate anxiety is often perceived as a problem affecting only the privileged in the global north. This misrepresentation stems from the fact that underserved populations, especially in the global south, usually have to deal with other pressing existential threats, such as social injustices and poverty, and their climate anxiety just gets mixed in with their general anxiety about all these things that threaten their well-being. But for the world's privileged and relatively protected populations, climate change is generally the only real source of anxiety on an existential level, and it therefore becomes the sole focus of their attention. If this is the case, privileged people, and I count most of us here in that category, privileged people need to be careful that their climate anxiety does not cause them to turn inward and develop what Britt Ray calls a myopic focus on the self and on the protection of one's own. Such inward turning can lead to xenophobia, exclusion, and even violence. And it intensifies the social disruption and inequalities that already are consequences of the climate crisis. To guard against this, Ray suggests that those with privilege harness their climate anxiety and direct it purposefully outward through justice-oriented thinking and action. Such justice-oriented thinking, teaching, activities, and attitudes are central to the mission and nature of Catholic schools, and this makes our schools particularly well suited to help students channel their climate anxiety away from unhealthy, fearful self-interest and towards thoughts and actions that are just, caring, and seek the common good. In other words, directing eco-anxiety towards eco-compassion. Catholic social teaching in general, and Pope Francis' encyclical Laudato Si in particular, are rich resources that Catholic educators can draw from in this regard. So for the remainder of the time, I would like us to look at some ways that the teachings of Laudato Si can help schools cultivate moral or ethical communities and foster ecological conversion on an individual and societal level. All right. So I want to try something with you. In the past, I have been a facilitator at eco-anxiety workshops for secular climate organizations. I'm the woo-woo eco-spiritual one in the room. I am eco-spiritual, but not religious in this case. And here's what I tell them about community in the context of climate activism. Community is essential for building solidarity and resilience, especially when confronted with the magnitude of the climate crisis. But it's important for us to recognize that community is not only about human beings. Us humans are also part of the community made up of all the creatures and systems on Earth. This is a liberating and heartening thing to remember, especially for those young people involved in the climate movement. The call to save the Earth is a crushing and impossible responsibility to throw on the shoulders of our youth, even though many of them willingly will march with placards displaying the same sort of slogans. Instead of thinking of ourselves as superheroes and the Earth as an object for us to save, we must remember that each of us are members of an astonishingly, I can't say that word, a really wonderful, diverse and intricate Earth community. We are not alone in this fight. Of course, it's still enormously challenging, but if we can learn to live in harmony with it, we have the entire Earth community working regeneratively in solidarity with us to heal the damage humans are inflicting on the Earth. So how's that? Are you feeling a bit better now? Are you feeling a bit empowered? Not like it's just you against everything? Okay, good, I'm glad. But now let's add a little Catholic social teaching into the picture, because we can, and as Catholic schools we should. And I think it deepens things even more. So, take 2, Catholic version. Time and again throughout Laudato Si, Pope Francis emphasizes the interconnectedness of creation and humans, and that humans are not separated from the rest of creation, but are deeply enmeshed in it. What's more, God is also intimately present in creation. I'm going to be quoting from Laudato Si a lot, but I'm not going to say quote, unquote, and all that stuff. If it sounds smart, it's Laudato Si. The Pope explains that in Judeo-Christian tradition, the word creation has a broader meaning than nature or earth, for creation has to do with God's loving plan. Creation is a gift from God, and God's love is the fundamental moving force in all created things. As part of the universe, called into being by one Father, all of us are linked by unseen bonds and together form a kind of universal family, a sublime communion which fills us with a sacred, affectionate, and humble respect. Thus, seen through the eyes of our faith, we are part of a community of kin, created and sustained by God's love, and which through its very being speaks of God's love at every moment. We are enwrapped in a community of love. But Pope Francis reminds us that a sense of deep communion with the rest of nature cannot be real if our hearts lack tenderness, compassion, and concern for our fellow human beings. Concern for the environment thus needs to be joined to a sincere love for our fellow human beings and an unwavering commitment to resolving the problems of society. Thus, every ecological approach needs to incorporate a social perspective, which takes into account the fundamental rights of the poor and underprivileged. If we are a part of the community of creation, oops, I should have done this a while ago. There we go. If we are part of the community of creation, brought into being and sustained by the love of God, whom we know is a God of justice, who sides with the poor and the oppressed, we are at our roots, despite our sinfulness, part of a moral community that loves and seeks justice for all its members, both human and otherwise. Each of our schools are called to cultivate such a community within the broader community of creation. But in this age of grave social and ecological injustice, this will not be possible unless we as individuals and as society undergo what Laudato Si calls an ecological conversion. So, there's so much that I could say about ecological conversion, but my time is definitely running short here. So let me just mention a few of the points that Francis highlights in Laudato Si. Recognizing that efforts of individuals alone will not remedy the complex problems of the climate crisis. Francis says the ecological conversion needs to bring about lasting change, and this ecological conversion has to be also a community conversion. So on both the personal and community level, these conversions entail fostering three main things, says Francis. Gratitude that stems from the recognition that creation is God's loving gift. And gratuitousness. In other words, practicing self-sacrifice and good works to imitate the generosity of God that is manifested in God's gift of creation. And thirdly, a deep awareness of our interconnection with the rest of creation. So I just would like to leave us with those thoughts. I'm sure there's very many ways within your own communities that you foster gratitude, gratuitous, and interconnectedness, allowing for personal and communal ecological conversion. But I think that's the questions that we have left. The time to discuss that. Thank you for listening.
Awesome. So we're going to invite you all back into the conversation again. We have a couple of more questions. So the questions that we had in mind here were, in what ways do you see these ideas that we're talking about implemented in your school community, or where do you wish they might be better implemented? What are some practices of your school that fosters communities of care, addresses eco-anxiety, and reconnects us to the earth? I think that's the question I want to focus the most on, if it's possible. And then what ideas and insights have you learned today that you want to think more about? So we have just a couple of minutes. I'm going to again invite our online attendees into breakout groups. I think you'll be in different groups this time than the last time, or I don't know. We'll see. And for the folks here, we're going to do it a little bit different. I'm going to ask you to talk amongst yourselves, talk to your neighbors about these questions. You can choose any one of these questions. You can talk about all of them. You can talk about none of them and talk about something else related to what we've been talking about. These are just to get you started. And we'll take about 8-10 minutes to do that. And then we'll come back to the big group, hopefully answer some questions, and then I have some thank yous and wrap-ups. Okay? So we'll take about 10 minutes. What came up in the conversations that you just had? And I would invite the folks from the online community, just if you could post a couple of things in the chat of things that came up, and Hilla will relay them to us. And I'll open while we're waiting for people to do that, I'll open it to the floor here. What are some of the things that you were talking about just now?
At every grade level, there is a Catholic social teaching that we focus on. And because of that, those students for that full year are looking at one piece of Catholic social teaching. But they were written almost 20 years ago, so we are in the process now of looking at them again and saying, what does that Catholic social teaching concept then look like when it comes to the environment? What does that look like for Indigenous relationships, and how do the two connect? And then Tina was saying there were mentor texts that came with that. And so we have a community called the Catholic Curriculum Corporation, and that community actually creates resources for teachers it's open-faced, so you can use it anywhere you are in the world. So that's making me think that that could be a place where this work kind of lands, and it is shared among all Catholic school boards in Ontario and beyond.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Patricia. And what I particularly love about that is that you don't separate out kind of the question of climate care from as if it's a standalone piece within Catholic social teaching, that it's something that gets woven into how we understand all the rest of it as well, how we understand human dignity, how we understand care for the poor and the vulnerable, how we understand the role of work in the world. Like all of these things get all wrapped up together. And I love that.
I don't know, I just think this is an idea for students. It's a little bit tricky because of our seasons, but if they could know about how things are being pollinated, like if they could be the gardeners knowing when are these pollinators coming in, which pollinators are coming into the garden, at what cycle, is it August, is it July, when are these flowers being pollinated, and when do the fruits start to grow? And, you know, how are the birds connected to the bees? You know, these kind of things. And how does this all come together with the Indigenous teachings?
Yeah.
And if like a summer project where they get volunteer hours, I don't know, maybe a camp or something.
Yeah, the climate makes it hard up here in Canada, right? You know, because so much of that kind of stuff happens during the summer months. But yeah, you know, getting that kind of intimacy with nature in all of its stages, I think is really important. Hilla, is there any?
Yeah, I'm just going through.
We only have two mics.
So we have some things in the chat here. Sabrina is bringing up the importance of land acknowledgements and connecting with local Indigenous partners to foster Indigenous land-based learning. Then Cindy is saying, we discussed specific actions that empower students, native plants, butterfly gardens, school and in community, being out in nature, often walks, outdoor classrooms, site-specific, outdoor, dance and art, our neighbors in nature, students learning names of plants and animals in the school environs, etc. Examples of regeneration of local areas, for example, landfill sites that have regenerated. Sabrina is inviting folks to critique the wording of the integral ecology program offered to secondary students at Sisters of St. Joseph website.
That's a wonderful resource, by the way.
And she's also saying, I am also observing a lot of responses to solving climate anxiety at the intersection of environmental/outdoor education and Indigenous learning. And Antonella is saying, to add to Cindy's contribution, I would say students love to garden and get their hands in the soil to cultivate their own foods.
It was one of the minor blessings of the COVID-19 pandemic, is that we all had more time to be out in nature. I am not a gardener, but for myself, just the daily ritual of walking my dogs was in so many ways a way of managing my own anxiety during COVID, but it also, like, it got me outside in the fresh air, on the nature trails, getting my feet dirty and getting my dogs dirty. Well, they were getting themselves dirty, but and all that kind of stuff. Thank you so much. Thank you all for all of those wonderful ideas. Just being mindful of, the time. I want to be sure to invite you to our next 2 events. So our next event is titled Science, Suffering, and Eco-Theology, and it will be hosted by the Durham Catholic District School Board in Oshawa. Like this one, it'll have an on-site component at their board offices. And an online component. So I would invite all of you who are here in person today and folks who are online today to attend that event. It is on April 17th at the same time, 4:30 to 6. Patricia. So featured at our next event are Adam Hinks, who is the guy on the left, who teaches astrophysics at the University of Toronto and is he's also a Jesuit priest and is going to be speaking on this question of science and faith. The guy on the right is Jean-Pierre Fortin, who teaches practical theology at Regis St. Mike's, and his particular interest is questions of suffering and theology. And so he's going to be talking with us about that lament piece that somebody raised earlier. Our next event is in October of next year, and this will be an on-site only event, and it'll be at St. Michael's College. We're not sure yet exactly where at St. Mike's, but someplace on the St. Mike's campus. And this will be a half-day long conference. It'll be Saturday 10 to 2 on October 5th. And our keynote speaker is Joyce Mercer from Yale Divinity School, and she is a specialist in youth and young adult ministry and youth eco-anxiety. So she's going to be speaking very specifically to that intersection of climate anxiety and working with young people. And she's going to be fantastic. We're really excited that she's coming. So keep an eye out for both of those. And a big, gigantic thank you to Patricia Dalben from the Halton Catholic District School Board and Julie Webster and Claudia Farrow from the Duffer and Peel Catholic District School Board for co-hosting this event. We couldn't have done it without you, and particularly their logistical support and planning insights. Thanks as well to Matt Kovacs from Halton for his help on the tech side of things. None of this would have happened without him. And to the Halton Hospitality Program for providing our refreshments today. We really, really, really appreciate those things. And of course, to all of you, both online and in person, for coming and thinking with us about this really important issue. So thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. And we hope to see you all again in April at our second workshop.